Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Saath podcast, ASR's newest initiative where we talk about substance use disorders within the context of the Punjabi community.
Through inviting mental health experts, researchers, community members, and those with lived experiences, we discuss everything from the history of addiction to the lived realities of Punjabi families alongside providing relevant resources.
We are your hosts. I'm Ravia. I'm a community organizer and researcher from Edmonton.
I'm Manvinder, a social work PhD student from Winnipeg.
I'm Harleen, and I'm a medical student and anthropologist from Indiana.
I'm Harpreet. I'm a clinical researcher and an epidemiologist from Toronto. Thanks for joining us, and let's start the conversation.
Hi, everyone. We hope you're doing well. We're so happy to welcome you to the latest episode of the Saath podcast. I'm your host, Manvinder. We're really excited to welcome Dr. Mauricio Najarro today. Mauricio is a lecturer in Health Inequalities in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. They hold a PhD in Medical Anthropology from the UC Berkeley, UCSF Medical Anthropology Joint Program, and a PhD in Theological and Religious Studies from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He is interested in developing innovative approaches in teaching and learning how to live together well. Welcome, Mauricio. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to know if you could just summarize what your research is, how you even got to this point. Obviously, you've clearly done a lot of different research, so wherever you want to start would be great.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I guess I'll start with what's most relevant. While working on a PhD in theological and religious studies, I happened to find myself in India, and I had just gotten into the joint program in Berkeley and UCSF. And I was telling people that I was going to work on substance use and incarceration and vulnerable populations. And in India, I was just having conversations with regular people, and they said, "Well, obviously, you're going to be working in Punjab." And I said, "What? What do you mean?" More conversations came out. This was around 2016. A Bollywood film came out named Urta Punjab, where there was a kind of Bollywood version of a conversation that a lot of people were having about Punjab, both inside and outside the state. And three times in that film, they said that they didn't want Punjab to become Mexico. And that line really pissed me off. And so I thought really carefully about what it meant to imagine what borders and drugs have to do with each other, what a militarized border does to a people, right? And this narrative or this script that kept happening over and over again, which was those people are bringing drugs over here to addict our young people. And right. So there was this imagined idea of who was at stake, which was generally the young, sick Jut boy, right? That was the object of concern. And it was the failing family, right? So there was this constant discourse of the family's failing, politics have failed, there are people in power who are benefiting, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was like, well, this is a really interesting story beyond the headlines, and I wanted to understand what was going on for the people who were dealing with it day to day, right? So I mean, psychiatrists, social workers, family members, people who are current and former drug users. And so I wanted to sort of tell a more fine-grained story, and that's what drew me to Punjab. And going there year after year, I met people, created relationships, and that's what brought me to my PhD project that I, finished writing and submitted in December, and I'm now trying to turn into a book.
Hey, that's so awesome. So I want to backtrack for a second. So while you were at Berkeley in your master's, that's when you first got interested in India. So was it through Urta Punjab that you watched that in the States, and then from there you're like, oh, this seems really cool. Let me go to India, or was it something else?
So it was actually something else. So in a previous life, I was working on a PhD in Christian spirituality, and there was a French philosopher named Simone Weil who had a series of engagements with ancient uh, ancient South Asian philosophy, ancient Indian thought, and had a bunch of these really beautiful, very idiosyncratic translations of sacred texts. So Upanishads, other kinds of texts. that were from India, and she was part of this kind of group of people doing work in Sanskrit around Paris in the early 1930s, late 1930s. And so a lot of theologians write a lot about her. She's very popular. People write a lot about this person's work, but no one really engaged her work in ancient Indian texts because Christian theologians don't really read Sanskrit. And so I was like, I will quickly learn Sanskrit and I will be able to understand what she wrote and write about it. And so many, many, many years later, and much, much humbler, I was able to write something about her engagement with ancient India. Not as much as I would have hoped, but really that's what took me to India. And I was in Pune studying Sanskrit over the summer in 2016. And that's when all these conversations happened.
Okay, cool. So so I'm assuming you went to Punjab to do, I think it's field work. So what was it like doing field work in Punjab?
So the first time I went to Punjab was actually as part of this NGO that was founded by Berkeley students who were kind of having these conversations on the Berkeley campus about going back to Punjab. Many of them were either born and raised in Punjab or had family that were from Punjab, maybe one or two generations removed. And so there was this critical conversation about people wanting to go back. And I was part of conversations with some of my friends that I met on campus. And one of them, who's a really, really close friend now, was like, look, just come with us. His family had a school near Amritsar. And so I went for a month, and it was my first time ever in Punjab. Like I landed there, I went to the Golden Temple, we went to the village, and it was great work. I kind of, it was cold. The people were really warm and friendly. The food was amazing. The conversations were really great. And I was able to get a fuller and richer sense of what was happening. And that's when I knew I couldn't tell a story of just like death and devastation of dispossession, right? It had to be something richer and fuller because the impression that I got from Punjabis in the diaspora was that Punjab was, in a sense, unlivable, that they couldn't go back, that it was something that either for political reasons or environmental reasons, it was a place that they couldn't be, right? That there was something that was lost. And when I went to Punjab, I met people that were like, no, this is a place like any other. We're fine. Like we're happy, we're healthy, we're trying to survive. And so I got a really different picture. And so that interaction between the diaspora and the people living in Punjab was really enlightening because it gave me a sort of different footing upon which I could ask some questions. So that's when I started going to Punjab, and I went to Punjab for at least once a year for many years after that. Like I think I've gone back. I can't even count. I was just there for a wedding, so I got back last week.
That's so awesome. Um, so when you go to Punjab to do your research, so what does that look like? Because myself included, like I don't have an anthropology background, so I'm not too sure like what research methods you actually employ when you're speaking to different people in Punjab and obviously like uncovering these like different structural things.
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and it can be really sensitive working with vulnerable populations. What I would say is, my situation is slightly different. So I'll tell you, ethnography is about a time and a place. So it's not just about Punjab. It's the fact that I landed in February 2020. Right? That's when I landed in Punjab. That's when I, signed a lease, and then suddenly the world changed, right? So these plans that I had of being based in Chandigarh and going out to the villages and meeting people and traveling and tracing things across, networks of roadways and villages and cities, none of that could materialize. It just didn't work, right? So I was sitting in Chandigarh in my apartment that was like on the top floor of my friend's Dadaji's house, right? Like sitting in front of my computer, attending clinical case management seminars and other seminars with psychiatrists from PGI, which is the big tertiary medical center in Chandigarh. And really, so I was affiliated with the DM in psychiatry. So that's a doctorate in medicine that is in specifically addiction psychiatry by this really elite group of psychiatrists that were based in Chandigarh. And I was trying to understand how elite psychiatrists learn about substance use, how they learn about new technologies, new techniques, new models for understanding it. And so that's what my fieldwork looked like. Is in the morning there would be these meetings that would happen on Zoom. I would attend those. I had already been part of the Narcotics Anonymous Fellowship as a researcher and a participant for many years, or not many years, maybe like 3 or 4 at that point. And all of the meetings had gone online, and so I attended meetings online on Zoom, and that looked really different during COVID because meeting rooms would open, there'd be conversation, there'd be talking, there'd be joking. We would have the meeting, people would come in and out. After the meeting, people would stay for conversation. Often you would have Punjabi speakers from all over the world phoning in. So there would be drivers from Canada, people from Australia. For a little while, there were people in Lahore coming in because they spoke different kinds of Punjabis, and it was really kind of cool. And so a lot of it was online until unlock happened, right? So India was one of the most intense lockdowns in the world, right? It happened, I thought, like mid-late March. It's so hard to remember the pandemic, to be honest. But it happened mid-late March. There was an intense lockdown. And then there were a series of openings that happened after the first wave. I was still in Punjab for the second wave, and that was extremely serious. And so my field work was really about not putting people in danger and doing as much of it as I could online. And then when I was given permission to study in person, that's when I did my interviews. So I would sit down with a group of people. I really like group interviews. I don't tend to, unless people are very close to me and I've developed rapport, I tend to like group interviews where they talk to each other about a certain topic. And so they're not just talking to me, this outsider, but they're talking to each other about a common situation. So what I do is I facilitate these group interviews where they're discussing whatever comes to mind with these kind of prompts. With my research assistants, we sort of go through the material that we've developed. I write some field notes on it in that evening or that afternoon when I'm really tired and trying to remember exactly what happened. And I try to describe the situation as I remember it. And then I combine the transcripts from the interviews with my notes, with the research that I've done to try to see if there are patterns that make sense.
Okay, so before I hand it over to Manvinder, I guess like this is a very juicy question. So, what were like the main things you actually learned from that?
So a lot of it was talking to people who had just been in de-addiction centers, and the policies that were implemented because of COVID in those centers. So a lot of them were shut down. A lot of people who had planned to stay there for 10 months or 12 months were there for 18 months, 19 months. There were lots of conversations around what it is that people thought they were doing in the addiction centers. So an example is like this one person, this one interlocutor of mine talks about how in these centers there were these rigid hierarchies that no matter how well off or how educated you were on the outside, once you were inside, you were kind of at the very bottom. And the longer you were there, the more you kind of went up the scale of this kind of hierarchy of people who were in charge of different quote unquote departments. So whether it was about washing dishes or making tea or doing the laundry, right? There was this kind of idea that what people were doing in the center was relearning how to be in society and how to understand social hierarchy, how to obey, right? That the problem of the drug user was that they had never learned or they had forgotten what it was to obey and to know their place in society, and that these centers were really reproducing society as this heavily hierarchical, patriarchal model, right? That was very strict on gender roles, that was very much about obeying without question, to create the conditions under which people would not use. So within that, there's a lot of assumptions as to what drug use is, why people use, how people change. And you would have conversations about whether or not these institutions were worth it. Many families would be like, no, all we do is we lock up our loved one in a room, right? Like we don't need to pay a center. Why would we pay a center? Those things are expensive. And so you would have these longer conversations. a lot of my research was about sort of figuring out what stories I could tell and which ones I couldn't, right? That was really heartbreaking to figure out, like, even if I had research permission, I was dealing not with poverty. I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday with someone about my research, and they were like, oh, when I read your research proposal, I just assumed you'd be working with youth, like poor youth. And I was like, no, like that's not who I'm working with. I'm working with middle-aged, middle-class people, drug users. And so this idea of who uses drugs and who doesn't is really important to sort of debunk, right? So like for me, I was like, Chandigarh is not a poor city by any stretch of the imagination. Yes, there are busties. Yes, there are informal settlements. Yes, there is like wealth disparity. But as a city, it is very affluent. It is very well connected. It is transnational. And so having a better conversation about economic disparity as a context for drug use is really important. I have one chapter on chemsex where I engage. Chemsex is sexualized drug use. So I engage queer drug users in Punjab, primarily through one ethnography where I look really carefully at 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 this one person's interactions with not militarized, like policing hospital systems and how they were in and out of hospitals constantly, and what it meant for them, and sort of engaging the questions that came up for them during psychosis, and during fear, and these kind of like longer resonances with longer trajectories and histories of family violence and history. I think it's really important to remember that these conversations are, these conversations are not about politics and history. When I talk to people, mostly they're about family. They're about the family that people wish that they had versus the family that they actually do have.
Thanks, Mauricio. Yeah, kind of along that line, moving us more into findings. I'm really interested in the role that the city played in your work because, yeah, I guess you were like kind of, yes, forced to stay inside, but you're still like a part of the city, so that kind of an inside-outside dynamic. And Chandigarh, as we know, is like India's first planned city. There is this like heightened surveillance, like you have to be careful, you might get a ticket. So it's this like, yeah, hyper surveillance, hyper policing that's also, yeah, kind of there to make people follow the rules, kind of make them obey. So yeah, kind of in relation to what you just shared about the de-addiction center as like a place to obey. Yeah, I wonder like what that interplay looks like. Yeah, so kind of broadly, like what role did the city play in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you said, right, like Chandigarh is the first planned city. It's the first city built after independence. It was a necessary city as an administrative capital, right? There were lots of debates among politicians and policymakers about where to build it, because Amritsar was too close to the border. Other cities didn't make a lot of sense. Shimla was too far. So, like, all of these conversations about what to do about a new planned city, and this Nehruvian imagination of what India should be as this kind of hyper rational modernist, imaginary of a future, right? Um, and a lot of Europeans, when they write about Chandigarh, it's like this really flat, obnoxious, like the Indians didn't know what to do with Le Corbusier's project. And you're like, actually, no, like it's still an incredibly beautifully planned city. It has aspirations of sort of this transnational edge. I have a colleague, Harjant Gill, who writes about it as a kind of staging city for transnational travel, right? So, like, when young men and women from Punjab, Haryana, and Himachal want to prepare to go abroad, their families send them to Chandigarh to get their English ready, to sort of learn how it is to be in a city. And so it's this kind of training ground city for this kind of transnational imaginary. And so migration is a huge context with which to understand sort of what's going on in terms of youth and masculinity and sort of aspirations and change. I say masculinity because that's what the context I'm most familiar with. These conversations are highly gendered, so I didn't have a lot of access to women. People call it Chalandigar, right? So like where it's you get ticketed, there's lots of cameras everywhere. But how can I put this? Chandigarh makes sense in contrast to the states that find it as a hub and a connection. And that's a really weird kind of like roundabout way of saying, like, when people talk about the police in Chandigarh, it's often in contrast to the police in Punjab, right? And to the centers in Punjab. Now, a brief history is that there was in the mid 2010s there was concern about abuses in de-addiction centers in Punjab. And so there was new legislation regulating exactly how many people could be there, exactly how much food needed to be there, exactly how many beds needed to be there, exactly how many doctors needed to be there. And that the legislation, those policies have changed over time. Most recently, they've changed as well. But what that meant is that centers that opened in Punjab had to close because they were basically earning a lot of money by saying that they were treating a lot of people and basically warehousing them. So a lot of those centers moved to places like Himachal, where there weren't as stringent regulations, primarily because the conversation was about Punjab and not about Himachal. And so they moved. And so a lot of people sort of like, a lot of the same center owners simply moved shop. Chandigarh versus like Punjab, right? It's imagined as being, how can I put this? It's imagined as involving less violence. And this has to do with the history of the Punjab police in the 90s, right? This has to do with the violence that was a very much a part of the story in the insurgency. Because frankly, what happens in de-addiction centers is not quite medical, right? Particularly the private centers, they're not medical techniques, they're policing techniques, right? So whether we're talking about people being forced to sit and stand, people being forced to wake up early in the morning or to do something else, those kinds of policing techniques were used to discipline people in de-addiction centers far more in places that are not Chandigarh. Chandigarh, the centers that I know, it's an expensive place to have a center, so like they're fancy anyways. And they operate fairly differently. They're a little bit more about education. They're a little bit more about vocational training and things like that. And there's no respected standard of care. And I would say that that's not unique to Punjab, right? I don't think anyone understands how to work with substance users because it's not a common problem. It's a common solution, right? Drugs are not a problem. Drugs are a solution, right? Drugs help people cope. They help people deal. They are a source of pleasure. They are many, many things. There's many reasons why people use. And so pretending that there's only one reason is a problem, right? It's expedient to do that. It's convenient to say, oh, we've understood why people use drugs and it's this. There's actually a million different reasons. And so really making sense of how to address those issues effectively through policy, through investment, is really key because I think it's a far more expensive problem than people think.
Yeah, kind of continuing on this narrative of like the people you spoke to, themes that came up. Something that I saw come up in your work was the entanglement between power, between devotion, between intoxication. I feel like I could see your like religious studies background coming out, which I really appreciate. Yeah, there's kind of this interplay of like nasha as intoxication. This also like being intoxicated with the love of the divine. There's like mention of people who use drugs being referred to as like buggets of the drugs. So yeah, like a devotion towards the drug or yeah. So there's this interesting interplay of power, of devotion, of intoxication, of religion, of drugs, like coming all together. I wonder what you made of that and how that came up with the people that you were speaking to.
Yeah, that's a really great question and a hard one, and it's one that I still wrestle with. Um, let me take it slowly. So the first conversation that I would usually have with people when I was conducting research, casually, would be about nasha, right? Nasha is a word that is used for both the drug and the intoxication, right? So there's a collapsing of meaning for those two things. And when I would say that, exactly as you said, Manvinder, there's often a conversation about good nashas and bad nashas, right? That you can have a nasha for study, you can have a nasha for going to the mandir, you can have a nasha for this or that, and it's kind of an all-consuming focus right? It's an all-consuming compulsion or desire, right? That crowds out other commitments and other priorities. And so talking about that, I drew on some of my training in religious studies to really ask the question of things like value, of things like sacrifice, of things like deep commitment. I was trained by scholars of religion to look for the influence of religious discourses, narratives, and subjectivities where they're least recognized, in places like the economy, in places like politics, in places like scientific work, in places where people don't think to look for this, right? Because often there's a lot of there are spaces that are considered secular, that there's a lot of labor that is required to make them secular. And I would say psychiatry and biomedicine is one of them, right? Where there's a lot of labor that says what we are doing is incredibly secular. Our patients may have religious beliefs, but we're going to translate that into a biomedical and psychiatric register, and we're going to deal with the real thing, right? We're gonna try and do a translation of what's going on, and that does a violence to the way that people actually conceive of what they love and how they change, right? And so I wanted to sort of address those issues without foreclosing the question of the divine, without foreclosing the question of desire and power, because for me, what's important is what happens after. I mean, the manuscript title is called After Devotion, right? What happens when devotion's done? What happens when this transport, this ecstasy, this feeling of going beyond myself is over, right? What do I do? How do I live? And these were the kinds of questions that I found over and over and over again, because in having conversations around bhakti or bhakti, depending on the language, right? Like they would talk about drug users as being andbhakt, which, if you're paying attention to Indian political discourse, is the way that people constantly refer to people who are devotees, right, of certain political parties in power, right? And so the question of what do you do when the drug no longer serves you? What do you do when power is taken away? What do you do when you see the world around you after devotion? And so, like, how do you come back to the world? Can you come back to it in a certain way? What are the calls of the divine in and through drug use? Right? Because often Christian scripts are used in biomedicine to talk about addiction and recovery, by which I mean often people will talk about it in terms of conversion, a conversion moment. And this is especially not like psychiatrists, but it's subtext of a lot of conversations where they're like, and suddenly he read Bani and he was fine, right? And suddenly she went to the Gurdwara and she is fine. It's that moment of sudden conversion that is a script, is a very familiar script of this kind of radical transformation that is religious and psychological, that may or may not fit the actual stories of how people use and why they use and why they stop. And so in the dissertation, I have several stories of people talking about, you know, uh, being overwhelmed with certain kinds of ecstasies while using and being very grateful for that. It's kind of really difficult to have conversations with non-drug users about the gratitude that you feel for the drug, um, because it does work, right? For a lot of people, drug use um, is about pleasure. It's about not committing suicide. It's about a lot of things, right? Living with difficult situations and difficult families can be hard. Living in the aftermath of insurgency and economic dispossession and no future, and a situation where migration makes it so that your best friend leaves and leaves you alone. Like all of that, right, causes an incredible amount of harm. And drug use is not only about harm. Um, but how people cope includes things like religious lives, includes things like religious scripts, includes things like going to the Gurdwara or not, right? Many of the users that I talked to talked about avoiding the Gurdwara because they didn't feel like um, they didn't feel worthy of going and being in front of the divine. because they might have left drugs behind, but they were still smoking, they were still eating meat, they were still doing other things. And that was the other conversation, is that like a lot of times, I would start talking about drugs, but the conversation would go very quickly to alcohol, to tobacco, to meat, right? And those are religiously inflected substances, right? And so people had different feelings about them. And so religious discourses and symbols and narratives seep into conversations around psychiatry and mental health, particularly with some of my interlocutors who did have episodes where they heard voices, right? And so having more robust conversations about what they thought those voices were, what they mean, without dismissing them as just saying like, oh, their brain is broken, they need to be fixed, which I find really offensive as a discourse, really dismissive, and doesn't understand the diversity of human experience. Yeah.
You're really doing all the work of transitions for me, because I am, wanting to move into talking about the diversity of human experiences and even like the different narratives that are coming up. Because there is obviously a harm reduction perspective, there is a biomedical perspective, and I guess we didn't talk about it at the beginning, but at the beginning of your dissertation, you speak about these different headlines, different newspaper narratives, how English newspapers versus Hindi newspapers, how they frame the drug crisis. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in like popular media, I'm interested in like government narratives, and then how are the people and families interpreting addiction? Because I think like, yeah, the popular discourse that I guess maybe in 2016 that was also coming up was the Rahul Gandhi speech about how like 70% of Punjab's youth are addicted to drugs, and we know that's an incorrect statistic. He cited the study wrong. But there's also, even now, there's this official declaration of a war against drugs. They talk about the drug menace. There's really this call for a drug-free Punjab in 3 months. And this like drug-free Punjab in 3 months keeps coming up every year. So yeah, these like newspaper, and then yeah, I wonder how that gets taken up by the people and people who use drugs and their families.
Yeah, that's a bunch of questions. um, so I'll take them one at a time. Uh, I'll start with the question of harm reduction versus opioid substitution versus recovery centered OST, right? So those are kind of medical ideologies that come from different centers, right? So Ames Delhi tends to be very much about opioid substitution therapy as the solution, right? It is very much grounded in a pharmaceutical solution. This is both in terms of policy and in terms of research, right? And so this is a center that is very much about like, look, let's get buprenorphine into bodies, right? Like if the question is about overdose, let's prevent that. Let's get people on something that is safer, safe supply, provided by the government, regulated by the government, etc. And so that is one solution to a very complicated problem. The other kind of solution is the one that's promoted by PGI Chandigarh, which is recovery-based OST. So yes, buprenorphine and other kinds of pharmaceutical solutions are part of it, but there are also sort of like the biopsychosocial framework of addressing other needs, right? This is, of course, a really complicated picture, a really complicated idea. Sometimes it doesn't live up to its promises, and it fails in really interesting ways. Often because people don't tend to trust doctors very much, and by the time that they reach psychiatrists, the situation is pretty intense. And so psychiatrists are not the front line of dealing with things, it's actually families, right? And so when I would talk to people about their drug use and what their barriers were to care, what they would talk about most is their families, right? About education, about the need for people to understand what it was that they were going through, that they weren't trying to hurt their families, or in situations where there was violence, that there were more complicated reasons, because I don't want to downplay the extreme forms of violence that I found in my research, right? Whether it's people, beating their loved ones, hurting their children, abandoning people, all of these are very real problems, right? And so families do the best that they can with what they have to make sense of how to address certain issues. Um, I came to Punjab in 2016, and I was like, oh, everyone's talking about drug use. There's all these, there's this, there was a campaign, there was a Black Week, there was all these kind of like really intense conversations in newspapers, both in Hindi and Punjabi and in English, framing it in different ways. I mean, I think as I paid more attention to journalism as a context for making sense of the claims, I found sort of general trends, which was that in English language reporting, there was a straightforward kind of like presentation, as straightforward as possible, a presentation of government policy with some interviews and commentary. In Hindi and Punjabi language, the stories were about individual heroes. So they were like, they would sort of frame it as this one heroic bureaucrat, this one person who had gone in there and fixed things. And so the idea of a hero, whether it's a doctor or a police officer or somebody else, that was the kind of difference that I found. Again, this is a very limited sample. This was only a few stories I was able to do, simply because no one was writing about it by the time I was doing research in 2020. And in 2020, it was all about COVID. It was all about COVID transmissions. Addiction was not really at the top of the foreground when I was doing my field work. And I learned that sort of a drug-free Punjab is very much a political football. It comes around with every election cycle. It is the way that different political parties. It's a wedge issue, basically. It's a way for political parties, whether we're talking about OP or Congress or the BJP, to really position themselves as doing something different. Whether it's and often they're just doing something different than the one who came before. So it's not really the most exciting thing. It's sort of like if someone's doing a very policing and militarized response, then someone else is doing a much more social work response, then someone else is doing something else. And I don't want to downplay it. These are people who are very smart, who are talking to experts. They're talking to different experts, but they are consulting with experts to figure out what policies make sense for the state. And I think that it is really important to understand that what the state is able to do is very much dependent on the funding that they get from the center. And so thinking really carefully about the relationship between the state of Punjab and Delhi, right, is critically important, right, about how much people are willing to invest in Punjab, and about what it looks like to really invest in things like education, social services, infrastructure, et cetera. Yeah. So the discourse about addiction is a kind of is something that people read and repeat from things like newspapers, and so they'll talk about why people are using. And frankly, I can't think of Punjabi families that I know of who don't have some conversation around drinking or drug use. It is a conversation that is had in different ways about different family members, and this is particular. But again, I want to emphasize this is not unique to Punjab. This is not like Punjabis are not extraordinary in any way. There are very similar conversations in other places where there is agricultural dispossession, farmer suicides, disinvestment from the center, migration, militarized borders. These are patterns that we see over and over and over again. The Punjabi iteration of them might be unique to its history, but the problems are not unique.
Okay, so I wanted to move a bit into recovery, if that's okay. So you did speak a bit about harm reduction, and obviously in North America, harm reduction, it's a very contentious topic. And I think you framed it really nicely where, substance use, it may not necessarily be just exclusively a cause of harm, but rather a response to structural harms. So I wanted to know, how not just harm reduction, but just like any other forms of recovery, what did your interlocutor say about it? And how did they understand understate recovery?
Oh, that's such a good question. This is what I was not, maybe I'm giving the wrong impression as I'm being interviewed. When I went into this, I was not interested in drug use, right? Drug use does not interest me. I mean, yeah, have fun, whatever, it doesn't matter. Everybody uses drugs. I was interested in people who wanted to stop, and wanted to learn how to stop, wanted to learn how to change and how to live better, and the struggles that they faced and how they did it collectively. Mostly because I'm an outsider, right? I'm not Punjabi. Um, and I am allergic to certain kinds of anthropology that parachute in from outside and tell people how to live. I find that really offensive, right? I don't think that that's a good way of doing things. Mostly because I'm Salvadoran, right? Like I'm Latin American. I have a post-colonial history. They're parallel trajectories, right? Like how people feel about the British is kind of how I feel about the Spanish. So thinking really carefully about the fact that like South-South conversations are really important in things like anthropology. Um, let's see, harm reduction. So I was interested in what people were doing to support each other and lifting up how they were helping each other. A lot of it was about these practices in groups, in mutual aid groups like Narcotics Anonymous, and the practices that they encourage each other to do. Now, I have experience doing research and participating in 12-step recovery groups in other parts of the world. And what I saw both in Punjab and in Chandigarh was something that it's not unique, but it was different, right? People felt really strongly that what was important was being together, being with each other, baichara, right? Like forming this fellowship, this brotherhood, and brotherhood in a very gendered sense. So it's a very gendered space. There were women who came, a couple that I knew very well, but mostly it's a male space. Within which there was incredible amounts of generosity and support, right? And it was not the kind of prescriptive, like you should do this, you need to do this, you need to write these steps, you need to do these things, because recovery in other parts of the world are all about these practices, right? They're these like post-Protestant Christian practices of writing down your truth and confessionally sharing it with someone. That's not what I found in Chandigarh at all. What I found was a group of people who spent a lot of time with each other from like morning to evening, hanging out in each other's spaces, hanging out in each other's businesses, driving around doing the Giri route around Chandigarh, like just hanging out late into the night, drinking a lot of coffee together, doing a lot of chenny kenny and chewing tobacco, and sort of like basically being with each other for very long periods of time and having one-to-ones, having conversations about things that really mattered to them, like their family or in their impending marriage or whether or not they were going to have a child, etc. All of these practices are things that are not recognized as harm reduction. Harm reduction can be a kind of brand. It can be this is what harm reduction looks like. And there are a ton of practices that reduce harm that are not part of this like, NGO label, right? There are many ways that people support each other that have nothing to do with that. Many of them were religious, right? Like I can't tell you the number of times that I went to go do mata tekna to like, with the boys. And it was nice. It was great. And this is kind of the way that people did the thing. So recovery was about showing up for each other in radically generous ways, whether it's in the middle of the night. It's about picking each other up and driving each other around. It's about celebrating birthdays late at night, outside of markets, smashing cakes into each other's faces. It's joy, right? It's the joy that you find in really supporting each other in living a different kind of life. I should say that it was really important to pay attention to age and generations in this work. Because what I'm describing is very much a young man's recovery. And as people aged out of it through marriage, or marriage or work, right? They would get a job. Sometimes they would get a job at a call center, which gave them bad hours. Sometimes they would get a job that required really intense work. I mean, many of the people that I knew were advocates at the high court, right? So that's a really demanding job. And so they wouldn't be able to hang out for as long as other people. And the people in the recovery group would feel betrayed by people that, they were once their friends and now they had this job, or now they had this wife, or now they had these other commitments, or now they had these children. And so they would talk about feeling left out and what they would have to do next, right? And they would have other kinds of practices with other people in different age cohorts that would allow them to feel similar connections, right? So yeah, that's basically it. I mean, the number of practices were really diverse. People felt really ambivalently about them. People so in 12-step recovery, you have something called the steps, which is often understood by people in Narcotics Anonymous or other 12-step fellowships to be something that you write down confessionally. And people had ambivalent feelings about them. Some people were really, enthusiastic about this practice. Other people were more skeptical, mostly because they were like, look, we don't want to be perfect yet. We don't want to be good people yet, right? We want to be able to have our girlfriends, have our boyfriends, have outside sex, hook up, eat meat, smoke. We just don't want to do drugs. And so this idea of this kind of spiritual practice that would make them perfect, right? They would leave their old life behind was something that they wanted to delay as much as possible. So that was another feature that I found really interesting and resonant with religious traditions, right? This notion that people could be slightly more casual with their religious commitment, and that somebody else they were the real devotees. We're not like the real ones. We're just sort of like here. So it's a complicated picture, and it's the kind of picture that I think doesn't reduce neatly to denominational differences. Notice I haven't talked a lot about Sikh and Hindu differences. Chandigarh is as much Hindu as it is Sikh. And it's as much Hindi speaking, I think it's more Hindi speaking than it is Punjabi speaking. And so and because it's the state capital of Haryana as well. And so this idea of this city where these mixes were happening really resonates with some of the scholarship on Hindu Sikh identity, on the ways that religious practices were not neatly separated out in certainly previous centuries, in the way that, and so that's why I found it really interesting that most ethnographies of religious people really focus on devout people. They don't focus on ordinary people, and people just trying to do their best and live their life. And so I wanted to sort of lift that up in my work. I'm not sure I was very successful at it, but I try.
No, that's awesome. Also, I really love that you spoke to kind of the community aspect of harm reduction because it just makes me think of currently in Toronto, there's this assault against encampments. But encampments inherently, that's harm reduction because you have a community of drug users there to support each other. But obviously, at a federal level, that's not recognized, and at a provincial level. So I really like that you spoke to that. And just kind of to wrap up this conversation, so you kind of spoke to this already, but just your positionality both as an insider and outsider in different ways, because obviously you are a researcher, so that does make you an insider, but then, you don't identify as Punjabi or as Indian. So I'm just so curious, how did that affect your experience? And did it help you? Was it a hindrance in certain ways? I'm just like so curious about that.
Um, it cuts both ways, right? I would say that uh, there are questions that I could ask because I was an outsider and because I didn't understand things. And so I was able to be curious about certain things that insiders might not be or might not want to be curious about. Mostly because uh, any anthropologist would tell you that when you're in a place that is deeply unfamiliar, where the language is something that you are learning, it's not a native language, you rely a whole lot on people that are helping you, right? You absolutely have to rely on people that are going to help you figure out things, help you figure out how to do things. Um, and so I never forgot my position as an outsider. I insisted that people call me Mauricio, like as opposed to giving me an Indian name. That didn't help much. I mean, I eventually I became Manjit because people were just like tired, or Mauritius, right? Because many people go to Mauritius, and so they'll say that. I was interpolated as a Sikh Jat Brar, where they were just like Manjit Singh Brar, and I was like, bro, and it's just like it's the way I carry myself. It's I'm definitely not Punjabi, but I am more or less brown, right? And so being brown in India makes a difference, right? Like I might be American, but I'm definitely not a 6'2" blonde person named Steve, right? And so when that person walks in the room, right, like the things shift. So I was always an outsider. It's funny that you say outsider because like when I first got there, a few of my friends were like, "Dude, is this guy at like CIA?" And so like, it was really funny because they were just like, "No, obviously like, he's walking around asking about drugs. This guy probably like." And then they realized I was really poor and like didn't have a lot of money and wasn't too interested in power. I was just interested in hanging out with people. So whatever. So yeah, I would say there are when people grow up in a city where they all know each other, because Chandigarh is a provincial city, people know each other. People know each other for generations. I should say that a lot of the people that I talked to were from Narcotics Anonymous, and a lot of their parents went to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the division between those fellowships was generational. It wasn't about drug use or alcohol use. And so often because I was an outsider, I could have conversations where they knew it wouldn't go anywhere, right? They knew that I wasn't involved in the networks that were already there. Obviously, I was kept out of the most sensitive things. And that's fine. People are entitled to their privacy. I do not need to know everything about their lives, right? And that intimacy is something that is earned over time and is always selective. So I think acknowledging my positionality as an outsider, as a brown outsider, as a Spanish speaker, as someone who suffered through the lack of tacos in Chandigarh, which is just a tragedy. Yeah, it was a lot. I mean, it's the nature of, and because I believe in things like vocations, I believe in things like being called to do certain kinds of work, right? By something that is outside of myself. And I don't know why, like like this is where I ended up. And, I I'm really grateful for having had the opportunity, and for having had people who trust me enough to talk to me about things that really, really matter to them. Um, so yeah, I do think that I do think that it's really important to point out the positionality of a brown researcher versus a white researcher, because often in area studies conferences, what you see is people from the place and white people. White people travel across borders very easily. And so in any area studies conference, what you'll see is white people and the native informant. And we should have Black anthropologists of Punjab. We should have Asian and East Asian anthropologists of Punjab. We should have people having better and different conversations, because people see things differently. So I do think it's important to diversify the people asking the questions, because the interests are different, the results are different. Ethnography is unique in that, like, I am the instrument through which I conduct my research. And recognizing that, like, it is okay not to be a 100% insider. I think that's a fantasy of a previous generation of anthropologists, of being someone that was completely included. I mean, as I was not included for many reasons, right? Being queer, being middle-aged, being a man, all of these things would mean something very different for the groups that I was in. And it gives me some access and other access. I should say that one of the reasons I'm really deeply committed to this is because I identify as someone in recovery. So I am very much not an outsider to some of these conversations, and to conversations about family, conversations about the afterlives of pharmaceutical interventions, things like that. So they might not have trusted me because they might not have trusted me for many reasons. But having a shared history of drug use helps.
Thanks for sharing that. So I think at this point, maybe we can just share final thoughts. So I don't know if you want to share anything just off the top of your mind, just to like kind of like wrap up the conversation. I know you spoke about your book, which I'm so excited to read once you're done with it. So just any future things that you got going on. Yeah, anything you wanted to share.
I mean, I, as I'm teaching, as I'm writing, as I'm thinking about my next research project, a lot of the conversations that I'm having is about collective forms of self-determination, right? So theoretically, what is, who uses drugs, right? Is it the individual? Is it the group, right? And what is the proper unit of analysis, right? Um, that's a really theoretical way of saying I don't think it makes sense to think just in terms of individuals. I think it makes sense to look in terms of groups of people. I mean, I have had so many interviews where I've talked to people about why they use drugs, and they're like, "I use drugs because I wanted friends." Right? That's not something that is very clearly a biomedical concern. It's a social concern. And thinking really carefully about what it would mean to take that seriously as a claim about health is really important. Um, I'm really interested in questions of collective autonomy, right? Self-determination, of figuring out what relationships to pleasure look like, um, how we can make more space for a diversity of bodies. If I could give folks one takeaway, I would say that like where you start this conversation really matters. And I think that the best place to start a conversation about drugs is about a difference in bodies. Bodies are different. Bodies are fundamentally different. They react in different ways to the things that we put inside them, whether those things are food or drugs or habits. Um, and so, really understanding that these problems are, um, there's not a one size fits all solution to a complicated problem, and that we start by listening, and listening without the intent to fix other people, right? Because people aren't problems, people have problems. That would be my kind of like soapbox statement, right? Like, start with the notion that bodies are different, start with the notion that's, maybe we should look at groups of people and not just individuals. Maybe we need to ask a question of like, what kinds of pleasures and lives are worth living? Because I do think I'll say I'll say one more controversial thing. And this is my own opinion as an outsider, and you can feel free to edit this or not. I think India and Punjab would be a much better place if people learned how to make aunties and uncles cry. If they understood, right, how to um, show up in ways that were authentic, to challenge some of the ideas of what a family should look like. And so this comes from my commitment as both a queer anthropologist and an anthropologist of substance use, right? Because I think it is a constraining straitjacket to imagine that all families need to look the same. I don't think that that's true. And the sooner that generations can be honest about what their family really looks like and the form of real care and real love and real violence looks like. And this is not unique to Punjab, I should say that. Like, it's not at all. This is just me being, philosophical.
Well, that was awesome.
Thank you for joining Saath, the Astra podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe or follow our social media at astra.now so you never miss an episode.
We would love to know what you think about today's episode. Please leave us a comment or send us a direct message. If you have any suggestions for future podcast guests, please fill out the Google form on our website or in the episode description. If you'd like additional information or resources in Punjabi or in English, please visit the ASRA website at www.asranow.ca. Thank you.